Hi, it's Llamaphil here, and this is Hang On from 1985. This is one of the many games designed by the great Yu Suzuki and Sega's AM2 division. Although it's fair to say this has been heavily overshadowed by its sequel, Super Hang On, I still think it's a decent game in its own right, and it's actually pretty important in the history of Sega. It's a good enough game for me to play it enough to try and beat it, which I did towards the back end of last year, and that's what you're watching right now. Hang On is significant for two reasons really. It was one of the first examples of Sega's superscalar hardware. This was a series of arcade platforms with advanced sprite scaling capabilities. This was a big deal for racing games, as it allowed for a much smoother sense of three-dimensional motion and perspective than was otherwise possible. Being able to make the sprites bigger or smaller as they approach or move away makes things look a lot better than having multiple sprites to represent objects at different distances. The second and possibly most significant aspect of Hang On is that it was the first racing game to feature a full-motion cabinet. The deluxe edition of the game was integrated into a replica motorbike, which players would sit on and control by shifting their weight left and right, just like in real life. By the time I was old enough to visit arcades, ride-on cabinets were common for motorbike games, but this was the first to do it as far as I'm aware. I feel quite fortunate to have grown up with the tail end of the arcade gaming era, and being able to experience games like this in person on a semi-regular basis. Even with VR, you just can't replicate the full experience of playing games like this, unless you happen to have a full-motion sim rig lying around. I of course didn't play this on a deluxe cabinet or a homemade full-motion simulator, but on a PC with an emulator and a worn-out Xbox 360 pad. It wasn't the true experience by any means, but it did the job. Hang On's presentation is probably best described as simple and clean. There isn't a lot of trackside detail compared to the games that Sega would make immediately afterwards, such as Enduro Racer or Outrun, and the music is pretty quiet and understated, but I actually quite like it. I find it very easy to concentrate when playing this game. The graphics are bold, but it doesn't have a lot of distractions. There were a couple of home versions of Hang On for the PC-88, the MSX and the Sega Master System. As you can imagine, they don't really come close to the arcade game, but the Master System version is a reasonable game in its own right. It was a system without a lot of good racing games in my opinion, and when you compare it to other early Mark III and Master System races, it's probably towards the higher end of the scale. It's not my favourite game from that system by any means, but it's alright, especially when you look at how early in the system's life it was. The MSX and PC-88 versions are pretty similar to one another. They're slower than the Master System version and with much more basic graphics. The home computers of the mid-80s were not always suited to this sort of game, especially those without good scrolling capabilities. The home versions of Hang On actually remind me a little bit of Hang On Junior, which was an alternate version of the game made for Sega's much less powerful System E arcade platform. Oddly enough, this was based on the Master System, but with more powerful graphical capabilities. If you want to play Hang On today, it works well in MAME with a regular analog control pad, or for those of you who bought the recent Shenmue HD collection, you can actually play a very good conversion of it at the U Arcade in Dobuita. Hang On is 5 stages and less than 6 minutes long, which I think is a fair length for a game of this type and age. It certainly doesn't go on any longer than it needs to. It's easier than some of Sega's games of this type, but it still takes a lot of practice to beat, and it doesn't really allow you to make any big mistakes. As with quite a few of Sega's races from the 80s, there are no continues, so you won't be able to credit feed your way to the end, unfortunately. Thankfully with emulation you can make save states, which not only lets you see the game in its entirety, but is also a great help for practicing specific stages. This video was a complete uninterrupted run, but when I was practicing the game I made save states for all the stages, and then practiced them individually as well as attempting full playthroughs. I even played the stages in reverse order to try and spend more time on the harder parts of the game. It was an approach that really helped, and one that I'll probably do again in the future. Overall, I think Hang On is a decent game. It's well worth playing, but I don't think it's something that many people would want to go back to very often after beating it. It's probably best to move on to Super Hang On, which offers everything this game does, but more of it, and better. Anyway, that's Hang On, and we're coming towards the end of the run now, so I will just close by letting the game speak for itself. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.